Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob is traveling this week, and I couldn't get anyone to pinch hit with me for the podcast, but that's okay because rather than talking about geopolitics and markets this week, I want to give you a little geopolitical preview, not just of Mexico's incredibly important elections that are coming up this weekend, but what these elections are going to mean over the course of the next 6 years, which is how long presidential terms are in Mexico. The first thing I want to say, and this sort of keeps with the theme of the podcast this week. Earlier this week, we had Akshar Patel on, and we talked about India. And I said in that podcast that I feel like the world really doesn't understand India, that it applies a lot of different categories to understanding India that don't actually map onto India. The same is true of Mexico. If you go and look at English language media about Mexico, or really any language media about Mexico, most of the coverage is going to be about what the latest grisly, horrible cartel violence was. If you dig a little bit deeper, you might get an article about the hollowness of Mexican democracy, or about how Mexico is going to become a dictatorship, or about how AMLO is going to take over the country, or something else like this. And you can't really get more beneath the surface there. So I want to get a little bit more beneath the surface because, especially for US listeners, there is arguably no more important geopolitical relationship for the United States going forward than Mexico. If the United States is going to stay on this trajectory where it has rough relations with China, that entire policy depends on close relationships with Mexico, with Canada, with other countries, especially in the Western Hemisphere, but certainly in North America. And that US-Mexico relationship, if the United States doesn't get that right, I would argue that the US competition with China is not going to go very well for the United States. In some sense, Mexico is the United States' ace in the hole. It's this huge economy, still from a very low level in terms of wages for labor and things like that, access to the Atlantic and the Pacific, some exposure to migration flows and things like that, but generally speaking, not exposed to a lot of geopolitical chaos. That is, if you want to sort of compare Mexico to the United States, is as India was to the British Empire after the Napoleonic Wars. That is how important I think Mexico is to the United States in general. And I know that I have a lot of listeners on the podcast. You're either selling agricultural exports to Mexico. I also work directly with folks who have supply chains in Mexico. It cuts across the economy in a lot of different ways. It's extremely important. And that's why it's so frustrating that there isn't a lot of coverage in this. It's also, if you've seen me on the road this year so far, you know I think this is one of the most important geopolitical stories happening in the world right now. So let's talk a little bit about this election, and let's talk a little bit about what is at stake in Mexico in general. The first thing I want to say is that I want to zoom out a little bit and think about Mexico's history. Mexico's democracy is incredibly young. On paper, Mexico has been a democracy for almost a century. But from 1929 to the year 2000, Mexico was basically a dictatorship under the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, the PRI. It was a single party dictatorship. So there was not one dictator that dominated Mexico, but it was this single political party that literally controlled everything in Mexico for almost 80 years. Mexican democracy really begins around the year 2000. And I say this because democracy is not deeply ingrained in Mexico's political psyche. So one study that I like to cite often, this is a Latin Barometer study from 2018, found that just 37.8% of respondents felt that democracy was their preferred form of government. And 38% of respondents said they did not care whether the Mexican government was democratic or not. A further 11% agreed that in some circumstances, an authoritarian government might actually be preferable to a democratic one. And this is one of the reasons I think that AMLO's presidency has been so important. AMLO has a lot of faults. He's an incredibly weird guy. Just look at his daily press conferences every morning where he railed about everything possible that was on his mind. He's a decided populist. He's definitely done some things to try and limit Mexican democracy. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But one of the things I saw was that another recent poll, this is from Gallup, said that in 2023, 53% of Mexicans approved of their country's leadership. 61% said they had confidence in the national government. When AMLO came to power in December 2018, that figure was 29% had faith in their national government. So AMLO has done something pretty incredible here. He has increased faith in the Mexican government in general. Now, maybe that faith is not there when you're thinking about certain segments of society, especially upper echelons, which AMLO has gone after. But AMLO has done things like doubling the minimum wage. He's lifted millions of people out of poverty. He's also done controversial things like empowering the military to go after cartels. This is the guy who wanted to decriminalize drugs. And I think it was Hugs, not bullets was his campaign slogan. He's prioritized fossil fuels. I said he's tried to pass measures that would hurt the institutions that are supposed to observe the legitimacy of Mexican elections, which ironically, it's the Mexican military and the institution that observes Mexican elections. Those are probably the two most legitimate, non-corrupt Mexican political organizations that you have right now. Despite all that, though, the Mexican people as a majority like AMLO. And I think that is something that Americans, that Mexicans, you really have to wrestle with that because the polling data is pretty clear here that AMLO has been a very popular figure. It's not true of the younger generation in Mexico. There was one recent poll I found of Gen Z Mexicans who are really disenchanted with the political parties. 3 out of 4 say the current Mexican political parties don't represent them. But I think you would find that with Generation Z in just about any country, political parties predominantly cater to older populations because that's who votes, that's who's actually involved. So I don't know sort of how much to really think about that. The second thing I want to put in your mind here is that AMLO himself really does have delusions of grandeur. And I think the concern about him as a populist dictator didn't allow people to understand what he was really all about. I remember vividly people were calling him the Trump of the tropics. For the first couple of years of his presidency, all anybody wanted to talk about was he going to defy the Constitution and stick around for another term? And he said he wasn't, and he hasn't, which I think is really, really important when you think about it. But the other thing is that AMLO has described himself as the author of the fourth transformation. And to understand what the fourth transformation means, we have to go through the previous 3 transformations that he's thinking about. So the first is the Mexican War of Independence from 1820 to 1821. The second is the Reform War of 1858 to 1861. And then the third is the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1917. So AMLO is putting himself, he thinks that his presidency is the beginning of this type of era. Furthermore, the Mexican leader that AMLO most admires is Benito Juarez. He is the leader that emerges sort of out of the Reform War, 1858 to 1861. It's a fascinating period in both Mexican history and U.S. history. So Mexico basically fights its own civil war from 1858 to 1861. Obviously, the U.S. Civil War begins shortly after that. While the U.S. is fighting its civil war, France, under Napoleon III, tries to institute a new monarchy in Mexico. They put Maximilian I, who's an Habsburg monarch, to become emperor of Mexico. Juarez has to flee to Monterrey and sets up his capital there. Eventually, the U.S. Civil War ends. The U.S. government goes in and backs Juarez. Juarez takes over for a period. But it's really under Juarez during this time period that you get the first real liberal constitution in Mexican history, the Constitution of 1857. And this Constitution, it's important in a lot of different ways. So it establishes individual rights, universal male suffrage, freedom of speech. It abolishes slavery, all sorts of things like this. It really limits the power of the Catholic Church. It also limits the power of indigenous communities and things like that. And that Constitution sort of becomes the framework through which Juarez wants to govern and that the liberals want to govern for a long time. One of the problems with that Constitution is that it does not give the executive a lot of authority. And so you get this dictator after Juarez, Porfirio Diaz, who comes in and he rules the country for basically 30 years until you get that third transformation. And then the Constitution of 1917, which is the Constitution that is currently on the books, sort of takes us from 1917 to the present day. Notice that Constitution of 1917, it's the framework for the pre-single party dictatorship, just like it's the framework for this young fledgling Mexican democracy in general. So when you're thinking about AMLO, he thinks of himself as a Juarez-like figure. So in some sense, the idea of him as a dictator has always been misplaced. Now, he is certainly a megalomaniac, and he is certainly a populist, and he has a very inflated sense of his importance as a world historical figure, but he never wanted to be a dictator. He wanted to be a Juarez type figure. He wanted his government and his political movement, Morena, to be the thing that set the course of Mexican government for the next 50 to 100 years. And that is why in February, even though he's not on the ballot, his party, Morena, put out this incredible list of 20 different constitutional changes that they want going forward. And this is the key thing here. It does not matter who wins the presidency here, although it's probably going to be Claudia Sheinbaum, and we're going to get to her in a second. She is the successor in the Morena party, and she's going to take over from AMLO. But the real question here is, does Morena win a supermajority in Congress? Because if Morena wins a supermajority in Congress, then those 20 constitutional reforms that we're talking about, they are going to be pushed through, and they are really a mixed bag. When you're thinking about what those constitutional changes look like, I mean, they're all over the place. There's a GMO corn ban, making austerity a state policy, eliminating autonomous regulatory agencies, allowing Supreme Court justices to be elected by a popular vote. That sends a shiver down my separation of powers spine here in the United States. Cutting the number of seats in the Chamber of Deputy, having the seats in the Senate. Also, lots of things related to, again, populist measures. So, setting a minimum wage for teachers and police officers and things like this. Reaffirming the right to a pension at age 65 and increasing the amount year after year, also ditto for people with disabilities, recognizing indigenous peoples, guaranteeing free and comprehensive medical care, banning the trade in chemical drugs such as fentanyl, different things about water scarcity and only giving concessions for domestic use. I mean, it's a massive package of different reforms. And this is the thing. None of it will get through, or most of it will not get through, if Morena does not have a supermajority. That's the way the Mexican Constitution really works. And the way it's one of the big differences in Mexican democracy versus, say, U.S. democracy. The U.S. hasn't meaningfully changed its constitution. I don't know, I didn't look it up, but it's been many, many decades. Mexico changes its constitution all the time. And if you want major reform in Mexico, you really do have to change the constitution in that way. So that's really what's going on here. And it's what I'm most worried about. So it looks like it's going to be close, but it does not look like Morena is going to pull that supermajority out. And that's exactly the result you want if what you want is stability, if what you want is compromise, if you want a version of what's happening in Brazil right now, where you have Lula, who is clearly a left-leaning populist figure, dealing with a legislature that leans more to the right. So they are being forced to compromise. They're both getting things that they want. Neither are getting everything that they want. The United States, I would say, Shelby Foote was the historian who said that America's greatest talent was for compromise. This is something that the United States has lost. So if you can get Morena in there, but not with a supermajority, you have a chance for that type of compromise. If Morena achieves the supermajority, then bets are off a little bit. And then we're going to need to talk about a lot of different things, whether it's protectionism in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, the direction of Mexican foreign policy, the power of the state and the Mexican government and over the Mexican economy. Wealthy Mexicans in general, if Sheinbaum got that supermajority, should be very, very concerned about taxes and all sorts of other things that would be able to be forced through. That is the scenario where a lot begins to change. The scenario, though, of Sheinbaum sort of constrained by a Chamber of Deputies and a Senate that does not have the supermajority, I think in some ways is the Goldilocks scenario. And this is where I want to get into Claudia Sheinaum herself. She's sort of a cipher is the wrong word. It's not that she's empty at all, but unlike AMLO, who is very outwardly charismatic, she is not outwardly charismatic. She is almost cold. People describe her as cold. And that makes sense because she is a climate scientist. She comes from a background of sort of a professorial background. I don't know if anybody else has done this. I haven't seen anybody else do this. I went back and looked at her Google Scholar page. There are more articles here than I had time to read. And here's just a couple of the articles that she's co-written. Optimal energy mix for transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. Energy consumption and related CO2 emissions in 5 Latin American countries. Social implications of sitting wind energy in a disadvantaged region. Sustainable passenger road transport scenarios to reduce fuel consumption, air pollutants, and GHG emissions in Mexico City. Using logarithmic mean index to analyze changes in energy use and carbon dioxide emissions in Mexico's iron and steel industry. This is a scientist. This is somebody who is thinking, who was trained to think about the world through science, who thinks about the world through science in general. Now, I did not have time to get through all of these many academic papers, but there was one that I read that was published in 2000, Mitigating Carbon Emissions While Advancing National Development Priorities, the Case of Mexico. Unless you are in that very small niche, if you are having trouble falling asleep, you can read that paper in general. This paper is about analyzing and integrating energy and forestry carbon mitigation strategies for Mexico between 1994 and 2010. And I just want to shine a light on the conclusion here because it really is interesting and it gives us a window into how Claudia Sheinaum really thinks. And remember, this is before her political career. It's what she actually thinks as a scientist and things that she's put her name on in paper. It's one of the reasons why I don't understand why people don't think that she's put herself out there. We have more data about what Claudia Sheinbaum thinks than just about anybody because she's put it down literally on paper. So the conclusions of this paper locally supporting activities where climate change benefits are a byproduct of concrete economic, social, and environmental benefits. And that involves an integrated strategy that combines institutional, financial, and technical aspects. And that's sort of a lot of mumbo jumbo. But the main thing is the main barrier to overcome is the increase in investment costs associated with carbon mitigation options. So already you can see she has put her finger on what the problem is, at least from this point of view. It's investment. And I'm going to argue that's the problem she's going to think about in terms of Mexico in general. Now, here's the more important level. At the national level, and I'm going to quote her here, the government needs to be consistent in the type of cross-sectoral policies promoted. For example, directly or indirectly subsidizing cattle ranching or commercial agriculture while simultaneously promoting sustainable forestry is a contradiction. Energy and land use policy should also address long-term concerns as opposed to the current 6-year planning horizons. Finally, there should also be a clear commitment to reduce present inequities in resource allocation across social groups and to keep the role of state investment in strategic areas. Okay, there's a couple things to unpack there. First of all, and this is where people who are established Mexican entrepreneurs or business owners, you should worry about this. She's talking about Mexican government policy is doing two different things. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So we're subsidizing commercial agriculture, but we're also talking about sustainable measures. So she's talking about bringing coherence to these things. And that's not going to be good if you're an established power there, even if she doesn't have the supermajority. Second, she's talking about long-term strategic planning beyond the 6-year cycle of the Mexican presidency. That's only possible if you have a situation where a party like Morena believes that it's going to hand off to a party like Morena, or you have a single party dictatorship like PRI. Mexico doesn't have a history of, okay, we're going to plan over the long-term horizon for these things. Usually a new party or a new president comes in, they completely change everything. At least that's how it's been in the last roughly 25 years in which Mexico has been experimenting with democracy. So that's an interesting thing, and that only works if Morena can prolong its time in power, which again is something that should raise your eyebrows. Finally, we want to reduce iniquities in resource allocation across social groups and to keep the role of state investment in strategic areas. Now, there's good and bad here, depending on what your point of view is. She very clearly wants to spread resources across social groups. And this is something that's really important for Mexico, because while Mexico has seen incredible growth over the last 25, 30 years, it also has incredible inequality. GDP per capita has almost tripled in the last 25 years, but average annual wages have stagnated. 60% of Nuevo Leon, which is one of, if not the wealthiest states per capita in Mexico, is middle class, while 80% of Chiapas is under the poverty line. And inequality has been rising steadily since 2006. I think one of the most challenging things for Mexico is over half of its domestic economy is involved in the informal economy, roughly 56% of its labor force there. So you have all these different issues when it comes to inequality. Scheinbaum's telling you right now that's not going to work, and that the government does play a role in allocating resources across these different social groups that have been left behind. You can call that whatever you want. That's redistribution of wealth. Now, you may think one way or another about that, but that's what she's saying in that paper in 2000. Her views have probably hardened on that since then. But last, and this is where I get some optimism, she wants to keep the role of state investment in strategic areas. So that's not saying overwhelming state control of everything. It is saying that if you identify a strategic area, there absolutely should be state investment support in those areas. But if you get outside of that area, probably the market itself should be left to do things on its own, or at least the government doesn't need to play that big of a role here. And this is one of the areas where I think she really is different from AMLO. AMLO is obsessed with Pemex, he's obsessed with oil. He doesn't really think about climate change in these different ways. That's not how Sheinbaum thinks. Literally, her entire scientific career is about thinking about climate change and things like that. So she's probably going to align herself very differently there. And she's going to think, yes, there's a role for the Mexican government, but the role needs to be coherent and it needs to be aligned very specifically to strategic sectors that are identified from the top down. I made this comparison to some Mexicans that I was talking to a couple of weeks ago. To me, Scheinbaum reminds me in a very sharp way of Angela Merkel, a technocrat, someone who is coming from a scientific background, who is coming at a very critical time in their nation's history. So Angela Merkel is coming post-German unification. Scheinbaum is coming at the end of the 6-year AMLO presidency, maybe the beginning of this fourth transformation. That's at least how her party is thinking about it. Nobody really takes her seriously. They say she's not charismatic. They say she's stern. She has to borrow charisma from AMLO, who's really the master puppeteers behind the strings. I don't believe that for a second. I think you have the combination of a technocrat, a scientist, and a skilled enough politician to rise to the ranks to become the president of Mexico. Now, maybe her skills are not the same as AMLO. Maybe she can't give those daily press conferences, or she's not going to have that same emotional bond with the population. Certainly, she's not going to be able to do the type of political horse trading that AMLO has done. And maybe that means these things will blow up in her face. Maybe, halfway into her presidency, we'll get another, election in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, and Morena will lose even more of its position. And maybe she will author the demise of Morena in general. But if AMLO has his way, and this is the way I think AMLO is thinking, I think AMLO is thinking that he's establishing a new version of the PRI, that Morena is going to be that new version of the PRI, and that it's going to thread a very difficult needle, which is Mexico is going to be a democracy, but it's going to be a democracy where everybody agrees that Morena should be in charge right now, because it's one of these pivotal periods in Mexican history where, in order to be on the right side of history, everybody has to pitch in and think in terms of these ways. So I sort of want to end the Scheinbaum thing just by saying, unless something absolutely crazy happens, knock on wood, unless it's an assassination, or please stay out of the helicopters, Claudia, for God's sakes. If there's some major election fraud or election challenge, like those things are possible. But that's not what it looks like to me. It looks like she is going to be president. It looks like probably Morena is not going to have a supermajority, and we are going to watch her distance herself from AMLO, try and pursue some of the policies that she wants in general, not be able to push through things at the constitutional level. So either that'll result in either stagnation or having to do the types of compromise and horse trading that I'm talking about. We will see. Like, the thing that I'm most concerned about, as I say this, I don't know if you can hear this in the background. I just saw a lightning bolt and a crash of thunder went. So maybe the universe is telling me, Jacob, shut up. You have this completely wrong. The real question mark for me going into the weekend is, does Morena get the supermajority? And if you don't know anything about Mexican politics and you're trying to understand Mexican politics right now, that's what you should be focusing on. When we start getting the election results on the weekend and into Monday, you don't care about the top news. You don't care about, oh my God, first female president in Mexico. I mean, it's very important. That's great. But that's not what's important. What's important here is, does Morena win a supermajority? If yes, buckle up. This could get interesting. If not, Mexico is going to have a very interesting trajectory here over the next 6 years. And I'm going to be very optimistic about Mexico at a macro level, even if there will be some significant changes for businesses operating in Mexico or for wealthy Mexicans in general. Overall, at a macro level, I think that would be a positive thing going forward. Last but not least, I want to say just a couple things about Mexico's foreign policy. Again, if Morena gets that supermajority, I think relations between the United States and Mexico maybe get a little more tense. The absolute worst case scenario is a Morena supermajority and then Trump wins in the United States, because Trump and AMLO had a very tight relationship. I doubt that Sheinbaum will have as good a relationship, and there are a lot of different issues related to economics, trade, migration, cartels. It's going to be very difficult for Sheinbaum, I think, to navigate that relationship in general. But Mexico is tied to the United States in a really meaningful way. Roughly 80% of Mexican exports went to the United States last year. Porfirio Diaz is reputed to have said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." That is still the case. But there's one more bit of data that I thought was really interesting coming as I come into this podcast and start prepping for Mexico's elections. This is Gallup data, and it's from 2023, and it asked Mexicans, do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the leadership of the following countries: the United States, China, Germany, Russia? 32% of Mexicans approved of the United States. That may sound like a fairly low figure. It's the top approval rating for those four countries. 54% disapproved, though. So you've got a high approval rating relatively, but you also have more than 50% disapprove. China, the approval rating is 29% and the disapproval rating is 48%. So it's not like Mexico is bending in the direction of China either. The country that had the best stats in those four were Germany, a 28% approval rating, a 43% disapproval rating. The thing I want you to see here, though, is that Mexico is expressing itself in a non-aligned way. It does not align itself with the United States foreign policy. It does not align itself with Chinese foreign policy. It sees a little bit more in common with a country like Germany, which is that middle power level. But generally speaking, it doesn't align itself with any of these countries. It certainly doesn't align itself with Russia. You've got a 60% disapproval rating for Mexico with Russia. Contrast that with some of the nicer feelings we've been seeing from Latin American countries or sub-Saharan African countries that have been seduced by Putin's propaganda and Russia's war in Ukraine. That's not true of Mexico at all. And this, for me, is the real takeaway. Mexico is tied to the United States economically, but it doesn't want to be. And for the first time in maybe since Santa Anna, Mexico has some leverage relative to the United States because the United States has decided its biggest geopolitical challenger is China. And we're going to have a podcast either next week or the week after with an author who makes that very case. And if that is true, if supply chains are going to continue, if all the things that make the United States what it is are going to continue, and you want to pick a fight with China, you need Mexico. You need that labor market. You need that consumption market. You need those supply chains. You need that entree into the Latin American world. You need stability in the Western Hemisphere. It's incredibly important for the United States to have a good relationship with Mexico going forward. And Mexico has not had that kind of leverage with the United States in a very long time. Now, Mexico is still overwhelmingly dependent on the United States economy. I'm not saying that the scales have been completely flipped. I'm just saying that up until now, it's been basically the United States says something and Mexico has to follow along. And whether it's AMLO, whether it's Sheinbaum, whether, let's say, something crazy happens and Galvez pulls an upset out of the hat, I think one of the things we're seeing at a macro level is that Mexico wants to go a little bit more independent in terms of its foreign policy. It wants to be a little less aligned. It wants to be non-aligned, if you will, more like India was in the context of the Cold War. And the United States, just as it is embarking on this pivot to Asia and this trade war with China, needs Mexico maybe to get in line when it comes to things like migration or trade or other things. And I think you're going to see some friction there as well. So I hope that these thoughts were useful. It's a 30-minute primer on what I'm looking at in the Mexican election. It's just one analyst viewpoint, so there may be other things. I actually had some really helpful conversations last week where I was playing these ideas off of somebody who follows this very well, and he said I was missing some stuff. He thought that Sheinbaum was not at all a pragmatist, that the Merkel comparison was completely inappropriate, that she was just AMLO 2.0 without the charisma. We will see. That's not how I read it. There's a lot of room here for ambiguity, but at least these are the questions that we should be talking about. If you want to think about Mexico's elections, what this means, the future of Mexico in general, it doesn't start with cartels. There have always been cartels, or in Juarez's time, bandits that were attacking the railroads. It's not going to be about, is there going to be a new dictator in Mexico City? Like, these are the old tropes. It's really about, what does Mexico feel about democracy? Is its democracy evolving? Is Sheinbaum going to have a supermajority or not? Is she going to compromise or not? Is she this climate scientist pragmatist, or is she part of a populist swing that is going to bring a single-party dictatorship again? Is Mexico going to push against the United States in terms of foreign policy? Those are the questions that I would ask you to have in your mind and then apply to your specific circumstance, whether you are selling products or commodities into Mexico, whether you are importing components from Mexico, whether you are Mexican yourself and you were thinking about, well, what does this Sheinbaum presidency mean? What does this mean in terms of taxes? What does this mean in terms of government involvement in maybe the mining sectors or the ag sectors where I have exposure? Different sort of implications, some positive, some negative for each one of those particular scenarios. If you want to talk about it more, you know where to find me. I'm here. And if you want to tell me anything about what I got wrong or what you're seeing, also feel free to email me. It's jacob@cognitive.investments. So, hope you enjoyed the solo cast. Take care of the people you love. Cheers, and I will see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.